role of geopolitics in trade, technology and risk management, and global risk mapping. Welcome to the latest episode of Chat about Geopolitics and Trade with the Seatrade Maritime podcast, hosted by Punit Oza, founder of Maritime NXT. Today, Punit talks with John Thompson of Ambrey.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and welcome to another episode of Chat about Geopolitics and Trade. It's been absolutely amazing to actually have so many great speakers and guests on this podcast, and today is going to be no exception. In all my previous podcasts, we have heard the value of technology and data in managing geopolitical risks. And today I have the pleasure of hosting John Thompson, the co-founder and CCOs of Ambrey Analytics, a global maritime risk management expert, which I think has been around for more than a decade and a half and probably has come into limelight recent times with the handling and sharing of information, especially on the Red Sea crisis. But just to give you an introduction, the idea behind this podcast is really to try and gather perspectives on geopolitics and how it impacts shipping. I've been in the industry for more than 30 years, and I've seen geopolitics as being a subconscious discussion across all the decision making spaces. However, consciously, it's never really come up in discussions in most of my conversations. So I'm trying to host various experts like yourself and others to really talk about it. So let me begin by asking you that very question. Why and how do you think geopolitics plays a role in maritime and shipping spaces? With your experience with Ambrey, how do you see that role coming more on a conscious level because of the information that you guys share in Ambrey? And why is it never really getting the kind of limelight that it's supposed to get when it comes to shipping industry with your own experiences and expertise in the industry for the last decade and a half?
It's almost one of the great questions of our times that is not asked enough in the right forums. So I think lots of people see in the mainstream media the shift in, what people are calling from, last century was the American century, and this century is not going to be the American century, and the upcoming powers of China and Russia and some of their partners in North Korea and Iran. And that is playing out in every part of society and industry and in the economy. And shipping is a huge part of that. But it's often the unseen part, I think. There are a limited number of people in the world who are seafarers and their families who are very focused on that industry, but a huge number of people sit and they click and collect, or they have delivered to their house items and goods every day without really giving a thought as to how that item has arrived at their door. And the globalization of the economy over the last few decades, really since the 80s and 90s, that was facilitated by the just-in-time nature of shipping, the low cost that offered per ton. And that worked very well, I think, when there was a period of time where ships could have their safety guaranteed in the main shipping lanes. And I think if you move past perhaps the tanker wars of the 1980s into the modern era, until more recently, that was the case. And actually, ships could move largely safely, largely unhindered, without too much geopolitics in the way, and the global economy globalized as a result. What we've seen, I think, more lately is as some of the competition between the superpowers is hotting up, and as some of the supporting states look to almost execute a shadow or proxy war through every part of society and the economy as part of that to compete with the established Western regimes, you're seeing that war move it. It's not even, I say a war, it is war, but it's a threshold below what people would consider a kinetic or a hot war. It's almost like the new Cold War of the modern era. And it's affecting shipping in many, many ways. And obviously in the Red Sea, we've seen it with the Houthis, who are proxies of the Iranians, but we're seeing it in a huge number of other areas. And it's an increasingly fascinating area to watch. And I think shipping is absolutely at the moment in a period of rapidly adapting what that demands of that change. Because shipping is used to being just in time, reactive, very efficient, and where things like affiliation and ownership of a vessel wouldn't actually matter to a trade, now it really does.
Absolutely. And that's a very valid observation. In fact, wars, their impact on shipping have not been something which is alien to the industry. We've had previous wars, be it the world wars or be it the Iran-Iraq war or the Iraq war that the Americans went to in the 90s as well. And at that point of time, I think one of the biggest differences compared to this time around, as you rightly pointed out, is the availability of technology. the availability of data and access to data, both from the perspective of the shipping companies having access to the data, but more importantly, the other side, the so called people who are perpetrating these activities like the Houthis are also having access to data and technology at the same time, which is kind of counterproductive for shipping, but it is a reality. And there lies the question that I would be very fascinated to know about with regard to Ambrey. How did the concept of Ambrey come about, and what is your kind of key USP? How do you harness technology to get the kind of intelligence which can build actionable insights for the industry? That's the fascinating part that I want to know about.
Yeah, and it's really how we've modernized the business. The business, I think, as you said at the outset, is nearly 15 years old. Ambrey started in the first wave of Somali piracy, actually as an armed security provider. Putting guards on ships to prevent Somali pirates from taking ships, and we've migrated from that into a technology company. Most recently, probably in the last 2 or 3 years. So we set up Ambrey Analytics, which is really the part of the group which is all of our data, all of our intellectual property, all of our knowledge and experience around intelligence and maritime domain awareness in the last 18 months. And what we're doing there is really trying to harness all the different facets of technology in the maritime domain awareness area to make sure that the information and intelligence that we have gets to decision makers in real time to mitigate risk, to reduce loss of life, to save time, to save money for shipping companies. And that is something that technology has really allowed to happen in the last few years. I think if you go back to our origins in 2010, 2011, and that first wave of Somali piracy, that technology didn't really exist. And now we have the ability to track vessels in multiple ways, probably 5 or 6 different ways. We've more recently, a good example would be the use of stay within piracy. Obviously, we do a lot of things beyond piracy, but if you stay within piracy itself, our ability to track motherships, which the pirates use to go out into deep water and to attack vulnerable vessels further offshore, is now greatly enhanced compared to where it was. And that allows us to understand an area of interest where criminals might be operating and to ensure that ships aren't in that area. So I think in the past, things like security in shipping were used like a seatbelt. I have my security team, I'm safe. If I have a crash, I'm taken care of. Now we have a sat nav, we have headlights, we can really look ahead and we can mitigate risk in war risk, piracy, and other areas using technology in really innovative ways to prevent loss.
Interesting. And therein lies a bit of a strange, as I was looking through Ambrey and what they offer as services. Obviously, you have a physical fleet of some ships as well on the security side. You obviously are offering these intelligence services. But more interestingly, you're also offering insurance at the same time. How do you kind of bunch these up together? Because it's an interesting space that you have a tremendous amount of value in terms of technology and information that you sit on. At the same time, you also have an insurance product which actually uses that same information to figure out how do you underwrite a risk like that, because you have a lot more information than a traditional insurance guy has got. Is that a very fascinating space to develop, I would say? Yeah.
It really is actually, and I've been in conversations with some of the really big Lloyd's insurers in the last few weeks, even. And I think the view, certainly at that level, is for example, the war risk market, the Lloyd's market, at a macro level, works very, very well. For years, has been a profitable business that covers losses, and through the reinsurance market as well, has functioned very well. But actually, at the micro level, at the individual ship or fleet level, I think the insurance sector has a huge amount of opportunity for a company like Ambry with our unique perspective. Go back to my point about maritime domain awareness and technology. Ambrey's footprint on the water, both in terms of the vessels we support, our teams on the water who are working sat on bridges, looking out the window, looking at the radar, listening to the VHF. We're able to harness all that information now using technology in a way that gives us a very unique perspective on what's actually happening in the deep ocean in a way that was just not possible years ago. And that means our understanding of risk, both in terms of the kind of the here and now, but also the future risk to a vessel, is much greater than it ever has been before. And that gives us a unique advantage at the micro level in the insurance market, individual vessel, individual fleet, to understand and price a war risk or a kidnap and ransom risk accordingly. And that's really what our insurance business does.
That's really, really interesting. If I look at an example of, say, for example, I'm trying to buy a flight ticket today online, and suddenly one of the extras that pops up is, would you like to buy travel insurance because you're going ahead? And this is a bit like that. I'm heading off to a risk area, and here is a click and a button kind of a situation where I say an additional top up is the insurance that you can actually get on. Is that kind of your goal in your mind, that you actually find that the owners who are taking risk advice from you to travel or go through these risk areas are immediately in a position to say, can you actually top up an insurance space for me as well? Because I'm actually going to head to this region. What is the best quote that I can get for insurance, for example? Is that a kind of a aim in your mind?
I think, in a broad sense, that is the way the whole insurance sector is going. But obviously, you're taking an example where you, as a consumer, are buying something, and it's very different in terms of both value and complexity compared to a business-to-business transaction. So, something like war risk, where we might have a mortgagee on the vessel, a bank that owns a large chunk of the vessel, things like that can really affect the insurance perspective. So, I think there is a way for it to go. At the moment, I would say the transactions in insurance, in war risk in particular, are old-fashioned. They're very email-based, they're very paper-based. I think it will digitize and simplify, and inevitably some of the links in that chain will go as it gets more efficient and follows a path a bit like the one you described for the consumer. But there's inevitable complexity in that kind of the value of the vessel and the mortgagees that are involved that make it, always inevitably there's a human element that will get in the way and make sure that they're casting an eye over these things very carefully.
Absolutely. But it's an interesting space because being a commercial professional, from my own experience over the years, one of the biggest changes that has come about with technology is that the people on the ground, whether it's operational staff or whether it's chartering staff, commercial people, they have to adapt to this changes of technology. The information available to them is probably much more than what was available earlier. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're using that information rightly. So that's one of the biggest challenges, that if you've used something for many many years and being passed down the generations, then people are comfortable with it. If you need to change certain amount of data points, people are hesitant to use it because they don't know how it actually works, which is why contractually you need to start writing some of these things into it. Do you see from your experience and your customers a lot of people actually saying to shipping companies, saying, I am a user of your vessel, I'm a hirer of your ship, I charter your vessel, but I would like to bring Ambrey, for example, on board as a risk assessment tool in order for me to perform this voyage? Or the shipping companies themselves are insisting, saying, we're going to use it and we're going to charge you into it. And they're writing that into the contract. Do you actually see the contractual sustainability of this kind of services coming into day to day commercial operations? Because without that, the common Joe on the chartering desk or operations desk will actually be just lost, in my mind.
Yeah, it was. I think there's sort of two parts in response to that. So, in terms of the charter party, we're often named, or we are referred to in the charter party, one either by the charter or by the owner, to ensure that the costs that inevitably come in with us is covered and who's paying the bill. So that's happened for years, and that continues to happen. I think the technology bit you talked about is really interesting. I think there's a huge amount of technology overload. If you go into most shipping companies, all the operators are there with 6 screens trying to make it work and 18 different logins to different systems. And I think a lot of the technology is designed, to serve up through a platform. And then you have a problem for people of, well, I've got so many platforms and so many screens, and which ones do I work off? And then you have a data integration problem. What we've done with Ambry actually is made our technology cut through the noise. Yes, we have a platform if people want a platform, but actually that's not how we prefer to serve up our information and our data. We have a system that only tells our clients the risk information they need to know that's relevant to their fleet, where it's trading, where it is today, and where it's going to be tomorrow. So rather than having to read hundreds of reports about geopolitical risk or the latest incidents happen here or the latest video that's come up on Twitter of a Houthi attack on a vessel, we send them what they need to know that's relevant to their fleet. And technology has allowed us to do that. And actually, in the future, the use of AI is going to allow us to do that at a much greater scale than it is now, because we can train AI to do what an army of analysts would do for us now. And as that improves, that will allow us to do that even better. So for me, the answer with all of this is data's everywhere, information overloads everywhere. You've got what technology has to do now is harness that and then only serve up what the user needs to know when they need to know.
Absolutely. But of course, one of the things about geopolitics, and especially with regard to what I call, I've divided geopolitics into certain impact factors, and one of the impact factors where you are covering most of the stuff in Ambrey is critical pathways, and critical pathways are obviously very important. That includes wars and proxy wars and everything that is happening there. But in this regard, there are so many hotspots all over the world. How do you kind of see this global coverage making more palatable for the industry? Do you actually see this as a way of dividing the globe into certain, let's say, polygons and then try and look at those things, because it's a very complicated space. And whenever I teach it, I find students getting quite worried that is not going to be able to cover the globe, so as to speak. They will be struggling to do that. How do you do that in a global space like this?
It's really interesting. So, most people, it's a human problem, right? You can't be across 15 different crises at once, but you can do with one, maybe two, or maximum three. So everyone's got that problem. As a business, yeah, I mean, we use polygons so that our data is all of the unique data that we harness every day and we analyze every day, that was reported in from our different vessels and that we pick up from other reporting bodies, goes into a polygon system that is global. But what that system does is it rates, each polygon rates the risk up to 5 different levels. And so we have effectively got a heat map that is global, and you can overlay on that other things of relevance, like the joint war committee areas and other things that inevitably get focused. They're designed to focus shipping and what it's thinking about. So actually, our heat maps show our clients what they need to worry about and where. They can overlay environmental risk, or they can overlay narcotics risk, or they can overlay piracy or war risk, or remove those and see the relevant heat map. That heat map is a live thing. It grows and shrinks in a live way using our algorithms. So it does the work for you to go, okay, well, that's the area right now that I need to worry about, including things like weather. If it's the rainy season or the monsoon, and therefore the piracy risk is lower, it will take account for that, and it will grow and shrink accordingly. Because what you find actually is, you look at the old ways of working, if you look at, say, for example, the JWC areas, you get, in part because of insurance costs, you get ships, they'll sail along the outer boundary and they'll go a long way around the JWC area to avoid paying additional premium and avoid the additional security costs that come with cutting through that area. And the problem is actually that makes you more vulnerable, because that's where, if you look again at piracy, that's where pirates focus their efforts, because they know ships do that. Whereas if you follow a genuinely risk-led heat map like we have, you can route much more directly. You can save a huge amount of time, money, carbon on the way through, and you can make sure that you're only spending money on security when you need to do it and not when you don't need to do it.
Interesting. That's really interesting in terms of how doing. But there is another conundrum here, which you mentioned earlier, that you have multiple login screens and you have multiple sets of informations that you need to kind of look at to make these decisions. And while you are able to overlay a lot of these things, one of the most common AI-based solutions which has developed over the last few years is dynamic routing of the vessel. So the dynamic routing of the vessel is basically, most of the time, it's weather routing companies which are offering dynamic routing spaces, saying that things are changing, please redivert. Do you actually see your solutions or your risk maps being able to kind of overlay on top of the normal voyage management systems and operational systems as well? Do you see collaborations happening? Because I'll come to collaborations in a minute as well, because obviously you're going more into that as well. But in generally, do you see yourself collaborating with voyage routing companies and weather routing companies in general to kind of combine forces to help these guys to have a single screen solution for companies? Will that be a future that you see?
Absolutely, we see it, and we're in conversations with a few partners at the moment about integrating our data into the ECDIS system that sits on the bridge, because really the security overlay, if you will, needs to be added to the weather overlay, the bathymetry, and everything else to build up that voyage picture. And actually, if you look at all the existing systems, they either say they do it and don't do it, or they don't do it at all. Is how we view it. So I think that is absolutely the trajectory for us to do that at the moment, and make sure that's integrated fully into the bridge systems, rather than what way it currently works, which is separately on the master's email inbox, and that's just not dynamic enough.
And also on the shore side, I think that there's a replicate screen out there, and the shore side is also trying to guide the master as much as possible, because a lot of times I find that there is a lot of miscommunication or a disconnect between the shore to ship discussions, because the data points that they're seeing are different. The guys sitting on board are actually seeing a different set of data points, while the guys sitting on shore are saying, "Oh, we see this, it's working, it's okay," and the guys are saying, "You must come here and have a look at what's happening here on the ship." It's a completely different place. So in that sense, I think having this single data source is very, very crucial in that sense. Now, coming to collaborations, obviously I find that you know you're looking at one specific area where your data and intelligence led solutions are looking at it. Do you see bigger and greater projects where you can look at other geopolitical aspects, for example, changing trade flows, and the fact that you actually have the ability to combine AIA's trade patterns with the risk analysis part of it and see whether going to a particular port is actually worth investing some more time and effort in that. Because the heat map is one part with regard to risk, but there's also the heat map in terms of trade flows and how often ships are calling that particular port and how infrastructure is developing. Um, do you see that kind of multiple geopolitical aspects being covered in a solution by you guys going forward or collaborating going forward?
Well, I think trade flows, trade volumes are important to our understanding of the market and what's happening for sure. And actually, also statistically, to the likelihood of an event happening to you. Because often we see some people rate risk without taking account for the volume of shipping go through. And actually, that statistically, it makes a huge difference. If there's one event a week, but only 2 ships going, and one event a week, and there's 50 ships going, your likelihood of it happening to you is obviously considerably lower. So our data takes account for those trade flows to make sure that when we serve up that data to you, you really know the real risk to your ship. So that's an important thing of what we do. In terms of how it's used beyond that, in terms of kind of commodity flows and commercial opportunities, I don't think the way we're looking at it at the moment, that's the way we think. I'm sure, a quant analyst from a hedge fund might find it entertaining at some point and find some clever way of doing something with it. But I don't quite see that link yet. But we certainly have a very good perspective on the market because we're watching what shipping's doing and why, and we're looking at it from a very unique perspective. But we're not looking at it like a charterer would or a commodities player would. So I think at the moment, not so much.
Interesting. Talking about unique stuff, when I was looking at your profile on LinkedIn, I realized you have a degree in geography, but also something called geomorphology. What is geomorphology, John?
It is, in layman's terms, it's shallow geology. So I wasn't sort of looking for oil in my degree. I was looking more at surface geomorphology, so the shape of the landscape in the more shallower parts of the world. So that, yeah, that's what that is.
But tell me, that's an interesting space, and I was actually googling that as well. Do you actually see that when it comes to the sea routes, of course, the geomorphology is not really coming into any kind of discussion. But when it comes to land-based risks as such, you do see geomorphology actually having a big impact in terms of how landforms are changing, and because of that, maybe the country is looking to restructure its own, infrastructure, roads and rails and everything put together. Especially, I look very closely at how China has been impacting Africa, for example, and pretty much the African landform space has evolved because of Chinese investments going in the last 10 years with Belt and Road Initiative. I would say it's become even more dramatic in that sense. Do you actually see intelligence space where land changes in land form changes and land changes also impact eventually the sea aspects of it? Do you see that aspect coming into it? Has your course or your study in geomorphology actually impacted a little bit of understanding on the shipping side as well? That's the connection I'm trying to draw here.
Well, the geo and geopolitics is fascinating. And I suppose for me, my perspective, my degree made me very aware of landscapes and made me very aware of terrain and made me very aware of how that affects logistics, life, the people living in and around those particular features. And I think when you add the geo to politics, what it does is give you the perspective of the people who live in that environment and what makes them feel vulnerable, what makes them feel bold, what drives their psyche, what drives that nation in a particular way. I think often as humans we forget our place on the planet, and actually, but that is what drives these things. That drives shipping. That drives the shadow wars that we're seeing. A lot of the way these things play out are people looking at those vulnerabilities, exploiting those vulnerabilities. The Houthis, the fact they literally by a choke point in the Red Sea gives them the opportunity to conduct a sea denial operation. Where the UK as an island nation built at one point one of the greatest navies on earth because it was an island nation, and that's what and so these things are important and they're fascinating as well in terms of the psychology of a nation, I think, and what drives
I
it
agree.
in the now and into the future.
And that's what I wanted to also ask about. With regard to your cutting edge technology, you guys are all the time looking at more and more data points and more solutions and information. What is next? What do you think Ambrey and the other technology solution will need to focus on in terms of harnessing more data? Which are the kind of next frontiers to go for you as well as the future? I would say, yeah.
The journey we're on, I think, is already the right one, which is enhancing maritime domain awareness through technology. There's so much more to do, and if you look at things like just the connectivity on ships and what's changed with Starlink in the last 12 to 18 months, and how that is revolutionizing that greater connectivity to each ship. is revolutionizing what can be done on the ship. And it's like you already alluded to it earlier, I think, the tension between the DPA and shoreside support and the master, and where decision making sits and where information sits and who has the best perspective. Does the person 10,000 miles away have the right perspective, or what was agreed as the route 2 weeks ago actually versus where the ship is now and what's happening now? And the ability to connect through 100 megabytes rather than 3 or 4 is making a huge difference. And I think that's where we're really focused at the moment, is making sure that opportunity is bringing both the information from 70% of the Earth's surface, which actually has been very poorly understood for a long time. Suddenly there is a huge amount of information we can draw from that and analyze in real time and serve back to whoever needs to know it. And if you use the analogy of say cars, where phone networks have allowed connectivity to individual cars, telematics has driven that, and obviously the EV revolution. We're trying to look at it with that kind of perspective, because suddenly we've got that level of connectivity and that ability to understand what's happening in the way that you might look at your phone and look at Google Maps and get density of traffic or whatever it might be. You can now get that through shipping in a totally different way. So I think that's the journey we're on, that we see as being really exciting. And when you overlay things like AI, the ability to understand and use machine learning, and I think it's amazing. And whenever I talk to big companies, I'll never forget speaking to a multi-billion-dollar security company once, and they had a big picture of the globe and every country that they were in, and they were in 120 countries, all of which had their company color on. And I said to them, you've got, the oceans were completely empty. There's 70% of the Earth's surface you're not looking at. And I think go back a few years, that was kind of accepted and okay. But now actually that connectivity to ships means that we can really understand what's happening out there. And geopolitically, some of the challenges, things like, the attack on Nord Stream 2, go subsurface now. That's going to be the next domain that's going to be fascinating. How often are we surveilling pipelines or cables? How are we monitoring them? How are we responding? And linking it back to, that sort of proxy war or operating at the threshold of war. You cut a cable or a pipeline now, that could be considered an act of war. And so that is where the future challenge also lies. The surface is just getting connected. The subsurface has got some way to go. We've got our hands full and very busy for years to come, just solving those problems,
Brilliant. Absolutely. I think it's going to be a fascinating topic to talk about, I'm sure, in years to come as well. But talking about the future, this podcast is also listened to and followed closely by a lot of my students and other students who I don't teach as well, but universities in at least 7 business schools where I'm involved. And all of them obviously like to hear what the business leaders like yourself and others have to share about what should they be actually focusing on in order to make sure that they actually have a great job going forward. What are the skill sets that you look for when you hire young people? And what should be their kind of goal to achieve going forward if they want to come and work for Ambrey, for example? What is it that you would look for?
This is something I relish answering, actually. So I was brought up in a world where, what your grades were the most important thing, getting a first class degree and A's and A stars and that kind of thing. And of course, those things are important to a degree. But for me, when I'm hiring someone, I look for a little bit of something about them. And by that, I mean, what is it about that individual that's a bit unique, shows a unique perspective, a unique drive, a unique determination, a bit of self-accountability. And that to me is far more important than how many A's or A stars or degrees they have. Of course, those things matter in times, but having someone who can learn quickly, who can assimilate quickly, can understand a problem and get on and solve it, and doesn't look to other people to lay blame or to do it for them, but does it themselves. That is the single greatest thing I look for in someone. And actually, they can demonstrate that because they've done a charity thing and they've done a challenge, or they've done, those, it can be demonstrated to me in many ways, but it doesn't have to be just within the business environment. But that's the most important thing. And also, it's what makes you stand out from the crowd, because I think lots of people have got lots of degrees and good grades now, but you've got to really stand out by having something a bit different that shows what you're really about.
Brilliant. Absolutely. This podcast would not be complete without thanking Joshua, your colleague, Harry, as well as Sarah, who I think is based in Singapore. All of them have been very helpful in terms of connecting me with you. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, John, and I'm so thankful for your sharing and your views. Thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing to have our conversations as future develops for you and for me.
Thanks, Punit. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you, John and Punit. That's all we have time for on this episode. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Sea Trade Maritime Podcast.